All right, we're going to call to order the November 2nd meeting of the West Sacramento City Council Redevelopment Agency and Financing Authority. We're going to begin tonight, as we do each week, with the Pledge of Allegiance. We'd like to invite our guests to join the council and staff in the pledge, which tonight will be led by Mr. John Robinson. The council did not meet in executive session this evening, so we're going to move directly to our general administration agenda, item 1A, which is presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda, but within the jurisdiction of the city council. As is noted on our agenda, we're prohibited by state law from taking up items that are brought under 1A, but it is an important opportunity for a public forum. We do ask that anyone wishing to address the council on this or any other item to please fill out one of the yellow cards that's available at the door and to turn it in to the city clerk. In front of the clerk is a timer that we use to make sure that everyone gets a chance to be heard, and to that end, we ask that all comments be limited to no more than 3 minutes. Also in front of the clerk is a flip chart that indicates the agenda item that we are currently considering. We do recognize that for some folks, speaking in public can present some anxiety, so we do ask that there not be any boos or applause or other demonstrations, that we maintain a civil discourse here in the chambers. And the cards on each agenda item are accepted up until the conclusion of the staff report. They're accepted at any time prior to that, including before that agenda item is up. But once the staff report is concluded and we've begun council questions or discussion and public testimony, we won't take any additional cards. So with that, we have one request under item 1A, and it's by Mr. Bill Lowell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. William Lowell, West Sacramento, for the record. I noticed last time I went to Woodland by way of Davis, I noticed the bus shelter on West Capitol Avenue, this side of Harbor Boulevard, westbound, was no longer there. And I was wondering if there's any plans to replace it and perhaps to make it more friendly in case of those heavy southwest winds, which would hopefully give us better protection. And just this evening, when I was coming from downtown Sacramento there between 6th and 7th, there were 6 YOLO buses that went by, but none of them came by here. That is, or they were scheduled to, because there were 2 Woodland Express buses, 3 Davis Express buses, and 1 number 39 Southport Express. So I'd have to study the schedules to see how much longer that is, but there'd be a 535 number 42A bus coming down there. But like I say, between 5 and 5:30, there was nothing from downtown here to this area and Merkley and West Capitol, and I thought we might want to evaluate that and not have such a gap between time services, considering you do have the 40, 41, 42A, and the 30, and then you have the other, like the 241. Anyway, I'll let it go at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lowell. That's our only request under item 1A, so we're going to proceed to item 1B, which is council communications. Are there any reports or other communications this evening? Mr. Johannesson?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Villas and I attended the City County 2x2. It's a fairly light agenda. We had a discussion on an upcoming Solano YOLO Economic Summit, and Don Saylor presented some information on the YOLO leaders, the progress toward the meetings in that regard, and that was it.
Mr. Ledesma.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On October 25th, I attended as the alternate. I attended the Delta Protection Commission meeting down in Walnut Grove, where we reviewed, I think it was the final draft of the economic sustainability plan. And there were the main findings, or the main takeaway from that was some very good work by our Yolo County Supervisor, Supervisor McGowan, who is also holds a seat on that commission. going through that draft and making sure that Yolo County interests were upheld in some of the language in there, and specifically going forward to keep an eye on some of the recommendations that came out of that commission, specifically around the recommendations for economic sustainability of agriculture. I know the mayor's been on top of this as the member of that commission, but certainly, as you've outlined, there's been some language in there that could impact us of being in the secondary zone of that legal Delta plan. And I think we did a good job of trying to make it so that it doesn't infringe on what we're trying to do here in the city. But anyway, we went ahead and moved forward with the draft after many changes that were presented that night. So that's all I have to report tonight.
Great, thank you, Mr. Ledesma. Are there other reports? We did host the regional chambers study mission here at City Hall on October 20th. There was no business conducted, but it was that study mission devoted a significant amount of its tour of sort of major things happening in the region to West Sacramento. Also that same week, Mr. Ross and others from the city participated in the Lambda Alpha. What's the I stand for? Do you remember? It's an International Honor Society of Land Economics, and we hosted I think semi-annual meeting here with folks from all over the world, or at least all over the Northern Hemisphere, and Australia too. So all over the world, the entire planet was here at the CalSTRS building, and also toured a good chunk of West Sacramento as well. They were quite engaged and interested in what was happening in our city, and some of the lessons that we've learned, and some of the implications for their work in other places. There were also folks from our own region and from the United States as well, but it's an international society. And I think Mr. Toppenberg, our former redevelopment director, was a significant part in bringing that event here as well. So it was in both cases positive for positive exposure for West Sacramento. And then tomorrow the Transportation Committee for SACOG will meet, and we'll have the Sustainable Community Strategy, Metropolitan Transportation Plan, Endless Saga continuing. We do expect to be adopting the draft of the Sustainable Community Strategy, so all the work has been leading up to tomorrow. And we've talked before about the timing issues. We think we're on track for completion of the whole thing by April, which would mean there's only a couple of month period where there could potentially be a Delta plan, but not a sustainable community strategy that would provide us a safe harbor provision. But we've been on the major policy issues of the document. I've talked before about the issues we've been having with the building industry about how to deal with dramatically reduced forecasted employment and population growth in the region, and we have adjusted those forecasts. One of the important issues around that, though, is that we've written the plan in a way to try to assure that we can get CEQA relief for the broadest range of projects possible. And so here's one of the issues is we have to, as part of this plan, determine sort of what the long-term growth forecast looks like, what the 2035, which is kind of the midterm growth forecast looks like, and then the 2020 growth forecast. And so those 2020 projects, it's projects that occurred within that 2020 period that are the CEQA relief, because that's the SCS period. And but one of the issues is there are lots of projects that you could anticipate in the region where you would be permitting the projects, but they wouldn't actually build, or we don't anticipate that all 10,000 units of a project will build by 2020. You might expect that you would start the phase 1 of the project, but not phases 2 and 3, just as an example, just generically. And so we've been trying to find sort of a legal basis for saying that the CEQA relief applies to the whole project, not just to that component which is being built within that time period, because obviously it makes a mockery of the CEQA provisions if you don't have to do a CEQA, if you don't have to do a full EIR on phase 1, but you do for phase 2 and phase 3 of what is an integrated project. So that actually adds, in terms of the unit count, several 100,000 units on the housing side and an equivalent number on the on the employment side as well. So that's one area where I think where SACOG's trying to be as accommodating as possible to a broad notion of what the CEQA relief could look like. We may still have a continuing battle. The developer in Cordova Hills continues to demand that their project be put into the map, and I am and several others are still resisting that. If we do that, we've got to look at University Park or whatever. I'm sorry, not Vina del Lago. What is it called? Vista del Lago? Vina del Lago. It is Vina del Lago. Vina del Lago and the projects on the north. That every jurisdiction has projects like that are outside of the sustainable community strategy, but that are potentially, projects over the next 30 or 50 or 200 years that you could consider, but we can't fit them into the envelope. And just as important, we don't want SACOG to be the first stop for a development project. So you should go to your jurisdiction it should be the jurisdiction asking SACOG, please put this in, not the project proponent saying, I want this in the regional plan, and then I'm going to go to the city or the county and ask them to put it into their general plan. That kind of turns the whole idea of local control on its head. So that's the major outstanding issue at the moment, but I think we're getting close to a resolution on the general policy, although that project still is a thorn in my side. So, Mr. Christoph, Mayor Pro Tem
I was
Christoph?
just going to ask a question. Will this affect, or can other areas receive the same kind of treatment that Los Angeles received for the construction of a football stadium?
Well, in theory, although the legislature passed a bill about Los Angeles specifically, and then they passed a separate bill that was supposed to be about other projects more generally, but even that more generally is about projects just like the Los Angeles project. Mm-hmm. So it could apply conceivably to an arena, right. But it wouldn't apply to a regular project that goes through CEQA in a jurisdiction like ours. So it didn't look like there was a whole lot of relief in that. So I mean, this SACOG procedure seems to be the best option for meaningful CEQA relief. We've talked about before why it is why on the ground it's limited in its potential benefits, but the extent to which there seems to be more and more interest in the Capitol in potentially broadening those exemptions if we get it right. So before 3 years ago, it was a lot easier to get CEQA exemptions if they were just for residential. Mm-hmm. And we made the case, and others did. Well, that's silly. You don't just, if you're trying to do urban infill, you don't just want to create housing. People need places to work and to shop and to laundromats and the whole thing. And so there with the economy, I think there's more and more interest and acceptance among the Democratic legislature in doing that. So there may be more, but we have to get the fundamental framework in place. So there's the policy side of the MTP and the SCS, and then there's the project side. And the draft that we expect to be approved by the committee tomorrow and by the full board next week does include the streetcar project at $150 million or $130 million at full scope out of phase one all the way to Midtown, and it includes 2 bridges, the southern crossing that we have paid most attention to. I think scoped at $150 million, and a northern crossing, which is described in the draft plan as starting between the rail yards and Richards Boulevard, but it doesn't say where it goes, and we have not had that conversation at all. Although in an earlier discussion, sort of at the very outset of it, there was the notion that it could even just line up. It could land at the exact same place as the I Street Bridge. Doesn't necessarily have to be farther north than that, but they need an additional access. So so both of those bridges are in the plan, as well as a variety of other local projects. But okay, if there's no other reports, we don't have any appointments this evening. So the consent agenda is items 3 through 8. The city manager has requested that we continue to a future date. Item 2, and so without objection, that'll be the order. So item 3 through 8 on consent. Are there questions or any items to remove?
Oh, I was going to ask a question about item 6.
Okay, and I've got one on 7. So items. Item 6 is consideration of approval of amendment number 1 to the contract for professional engineers with Carollo Engineers for the Bridge District Water Storage Facility and Park Project. Mr. Ledesma?
Thank you. I just had a question on, I just had a hard time following the staff report and sort of we're approving an increase on the contract, or are we approving more work that was done that wasn't anticipated on the contract?
Is this on? Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this is an amendment to the original Corolla design contract. When we originally went out for RFPs for the water tank design, we were on a very strict and limited budget, so we negotiated down to like a minimum, very basic minimum design contract. As you're aware, as we got through design and through the public process and the Arts Commission and the Parks Commission, you know, the scope of work expanded. And they wanted a taller, narrower tank, which put more concentrated loads, which was a pile foundation. So the design got more complex, and we exceeded their design scope of work. And because design is more complex, the construction is also more complex. We need more oversight, more site visits, and there's going to be more requests, reviews for information, more submittal reviews, you know, for the extra equipment and whatever. So because we were really, really hard on the initial negotiation and got them down to bare bones, we now need to adjust your contract to account for the additional work and the extra complexity of the project.
So this is covering the work that's been done already? Are we anticipating?
Some of the work has been done during the design phase, like I said, the commission meetings and the Arts Council meetings. That work is, and they produced renderings, and they
Right.
incorporated those comments into the design.
Okay.
So that work has already been done. And now we have a more comprehensive and more complex design. Now we awarded the contract, we're under construction. Now there's more requests from the contractor for clarifications and, you know, requests for information, and there's going to be more submittals because, you know, we added additional equipment in, and we also add alternate items onto the contract. You know, in case the bids came in low, we wanted extra items to, you know, to include, and we awarded all the add alternates. So there will be design review of, you know, of the contractor submittal for those as well.
Okay, so the 114,000 thereabouts that is being requested here, we should be okay? I mean, and we're given the authorization for 10%. I just want to make sure. I understand now. Thank you for clarifying kind of what this is covering. I just want to make sure that I support the process we went through and everything else, because it's where it needs to be. I just want to make sure we've got it covered and we're not coming back.
Oh, no, this should cover. We asked the consultant, you know, dot all the i's and cross all the t's, make sure you have everything covered, because, you know, we don't like coming back asking for additional money. And actually, we're not asking for additional money. This money's already in the budget.
Okay.
We're just asking for the authority to.
Okay.
to
Thank you for clarifying. Okay.
expend the funds.
All right.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Cameron, will there be any additional dollars spent then on the actual construction of the tank or some of the infrastructure?
The bids came in, included all the design features. So when we went out to bid, you know, all the features were in the plans and specs, so the bids, all that was included into the bid. So the contract that was awarded includes all the upgrades that were requested.
So we should have the park in, the water tank, everything ready to go, except for an additional 113,000.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the 113 is already in the budget. When we brought the budget forward, when we awarded the contract, we anticipated this contract amendment, and that was included in part of the project budget. Thank you.
Item 7 is consideration and second reading and adoption of ordinance 11-13, amending chapter 8.12 of the municipal code relating to fireworks. Is this you, Ms. Richardson, or you, Ms. Chavin, or? I can try. So I think, so we raised this issue with at the workshop around the minimum membership provision. So this language allows for organizations, if they have at least 20 volunteers as opposed to 20 members.
Correct.
To be eligible. And at the last meeting during the workshop, we said we want those to be West Sacramentans. And then it looks like in between somebody looked at thought about it more and looked at the language and said, hey, we already had solved that problem by the other language in the ordinance
Well,
that says
yeah,
that
I
it has
think-
to be West Sacramento based and provide a West Sacramento benefit. Because the language doesn't actually do anything with respect to the volunteer piece.
Correct. When you had the report last time, I believe you didn't have a copy of the original ordinance. And on page 2 of that ordinance, it does indicate the criteria. They have to be within West Sacramento. So that basically covers that criteria. So yeah, in essence, we really don't need that additional 2 words. But I don't know if it's superfluous.
Yeah, I think we do need it. I mean,
Okay.
that other language is in there, but, I mean, so the other language being that we say it has to be a nonprofit that's organized in West Sac, that it has to meet in West Sac, and that it has to provide either a benefit or provide a service to our citizens. So those are all clear. And then we say, if you're, say you're the West Sacramento Art Guild, you can only participate if you have 20 members or more who are residents or business owners in the city. That's an additional requirement, in addition to the fact that you have to have a West Sacramento focus, that West Sacramentans have to be involved in it. You can't just set up and shop. Like, we have so many of these, like, Yolo County-based groups, just to be perfectly blunt, who are, like, their boards of directors are in Davis and Woodland, but they want to provide services for us, on our behalf, like the Peace Corps or something. So they set up shop here as a nonprofit, but they're not us, and they're doing value. It's not that they're not doing valuable work, they are, but in terms of, competing with the West Sacramento Little League or the kinds of local groups that I know my colleagues who've worked a lot on this, have been trying to, how do we make up for the fact that we need a mechanism to support really West Sacramento citizens trying to do, volunteer and nonprofit activity in our community. So I worry that just saying, if you're just talking about membership, it has to be West Sacramentans, but if you have no West Sacramentans involved, if you just have 20 volunteers that are all from Woodland and your board of directors is all in Davis, as long as you have an office here or an address here, right, your nonprofit ID number is addressed here, and you say that you're providing a service to homeless people in West Sacramento or whatever, that you have the same qualification. Whereas the Art Guild, which has traditionally struggled to have more than 11 or 12 members, the West Sacramento Art Guild wouldn't qualify.
So how would you want to word that? I mean, do you have a specific language that would cover what you just suggested?
So, I mean, which is that just as we say the members have to be residents.
Okay.
For this provision, either the members of the business owners have to be residents of West Sac. If you use the alternative path, which is the volunteers, those volunteers should be West Sacramentans. Well, we're using the 20
He wants all
figure.
20
So, I
of
mean, the
them.
notion that 20 West Sacramentans are involved in this is because the alternative is to have some sort of like substantive review where the Parks Department or the city manager is personally going through and saying, is this really a West Sacramento benefit or not? And none of us want to have staff spending time doing that. And so a kind of a quick rough way to do that was say, if there's 20 West Sacramentans involved in this, then it counts. And so to me that the standard ought to be the same, whether it's members or this alternative volunteer process. Mr. Johansson?
Yeah, I agree. If you're setting a de minimis of 20, that does require a lot of the nonprofits to be able to get 20 people together is tough. And you want to have the nonprofits that are really serious about this to make the effort to get West Sacramento people involved and engaged in their community. And then they could have 30 or 40 after that, but the first 20 would have to be West Sac residents. And I think it would be just as simple as adding language to this paragraph H4 and just say West Sacramento, where it says, or attests that the otherwise qualified organizations will have minimum membership of 20 volunteers who are West Sacramento residents, something along that line. Address that issue.
Those are the two things that city manager and I were talking about. You could either strike out the new language and up where it says 20 members, be 20 members or volunteers.
Yeah, and/or volunteers, and cross out that other language.
Or you could leave in the new language, but say minimum membership of 20 volunteers who are residents of West Sacramento.
I would think that the latter would be better, just because it puts people on notice that they need to build a West Sac organization in order to do this. I mean, if you have a layperson reading that, one of the two interpretations.
I think both would accomplish what you're describing, so.
Father of fireworks ordinance.
Yeah. She didn't say illegal fireworks. All right, so in this instance then, because I'm fine with that. So in this instance, Janet, your understanding of a qualified applicant, if there are two organizations combined, they would have to meet the 20-person threshold?
No, it's one organization.
One organization, so
They
in
have to
some,
have 20 members and/or volunteers that reside in West Sacramento in order for them to meet the criteria to be in the lottery for the fireworks booth.
right, but in some cases, the organizations are partnering because they can't.
That's up to them after the fact. I think they initially go in as one organization.
So if they go in as one organization, they would, so you have two organizations, they each have 10 people.
They have to have at least 20.
So they would have to have 20
initially be in the lottery.
separately to be considered. Okay,
That's how the ordinance reads now.
yeah.
They could meet the 20 by having one be the lead and the other be volunteers to that one.
But
Right.
that one would need to have at least the 20.
Right, under the current rule, the one would have to have 20 members. There's no volunteer provision at all, so the
Right,
partnering doesn't
right,
work
right.
very effectively. But under what we've just talked about, the one could have 10 members, and and those 10 members are gonna volunteer, and we're partnering with this other group that has 10 members, and all of its 10 members are gonna volunteer, so we'll trigger the volunteer provision. Whereas under the current ordinance, they wouldn't be able to be in the lottery at all. Right. Any other comments or discussion? Okay. Well, all right, so is there a motion on the consent agenda then? Second. So are you moving it with that?
With that, suggested language to the city attorney.
Okay. Seeing no.
One last suggestion, actually, if we're gonna do that, I would suggest in the new language, we strike out the word membership. Because it's really not, you're looking for a minimum membership, you're looking for a minimum of 20 volunteers who reside in West Sacramento.
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and so that's friendly to the maker and the seconder. No further discussion. All those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Consent agenda is adopted. Thank you. Onto our regular agenda, item 9 is a workshop and proposed amendments to the wireless telecommunications facilities policy.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council. Tonight, myself and Kathy Allen from our planning staff are here to present some changes and updates to the city's wireless telecommunications policy. This policy, which was first adopted in 1997, establishes the city's policy goals and also regulatory scheme for how new wireless projects, cell towers, and the like are to be processed, here in our community. Although, as everyone should be well aware, wireless usage has grown, exponentially since that time. Our policy has remained unchanged since it was originally written. And we have been working on two major wireless projects over the last year or so, one of which made its way for at least a preliminary review through the Planning Commission. And Planning Commission at that time asked us to work on some changes to the wireless policy to assist them in their review of those projects that are before them. So tonight I just want to summarize some of the changes that we have before you tonight. In our estimation, changes improve the policy's application, in terms of the review of the wireless projects that we see, here in 2011 beyond. But they doesn't really materially alter the objectives from the original policy, which are, in our staff's estimation, still remain valid and appropriate goals. So in the wireless policy now, we now require stealthing of projects. This has kind of been more of an informal policy that we've been applying as projects has come along, but we now want to formalize that. And by stealthing, it means that rather than putting up a traditional pole, someone might construct a windmill or or a tree, for example. We have also tried to strengthen the existing goals for co-location, so we can try to minimize the number of facilities that need to be built. And as state and federal law has evolved on this particular industry, we've actually created a new permit type to be able to, and new findings to be able to apply specifically to wireless policy, wireless projects, so that the discretion that the city and local governments are still afforded under state and federal law, we maintain as much discretion as we are permitted to have. Most wireless projects that we expect to come into the community will still go to the Planning Commission in a formal public hearing setting. That will be noticed. That is largely unchanged from our existing policy. Projects that will no longer require discretionary review are co-locations. This is where if one particular carrier wants to add antennas to an existing pole somewhere in the community, state law has changed on that in the last few years, so we don't require discretionary review for those co-locations in that scenario, which over the years historically have not been controversial to add additional antennas to an existing pole. There were two outstanding issues that the Planning Commission, under their review, did not have consensus on, and they did ask us to forward those further to the council for potential additional direction. The first was related to height, and more specifically, the appropriate height of a wireless facility when it's within certain proximity of residential areas. This is the kind of where we've struggled, the most in review of the two wireless projects that we have in right now, and many of the inquiries that we get from potential wireless providers are interested in putting facilities much closer to residential areas than we have seen historically. And so there was not consensus amongst what, if any, should be appropriate height or height limit for a facility when it's near residential. Staff did not recommend putting any formal height limits on the facilities, but rather rely on the existing height limits that are in the zoning ordinance, and still noting that the Planning Commission and/or Council will have discretion over these facilities as they come through for their wireless permit, and that height can be reviewed still at the individual project stage. Planning Commission also recognized that if there was a desire to have a lower height limit potentially when in proximity to residential, the trade-off may mean that may mean need to construct more facilities if there's less room on a lower pole for multiple carriers to be located on one. So we're appreciative of that potential trade-off that is there. The second matter Planning Commission did not have consensus on was related to any recommended setback from residential areas, to the facility. In your packet tonight, you provided those color maps where we provided an illustration using Southport as an example of what areas would be available based on current zoning if there was a 500-foot setback requirement, a 300-foot setback, and a 100-foot setback, for example. And the speckled areas on those maps, in which we have them here and can put them up on the screen if so desired, show those areas would be available. And you can review by most of those maps that there are very limited locations, even at the 100 or 300-foot buffer, where a facility could be located, under those concepts. And so we actually, in the policy, which ultimately the Planning Commission did approve to recommend to your council, was requiring a minimum setback equivalent to 2 times the height of the proposed facility. So this would, provide that manner in there still under our review, but it would mean that if somebody wants to put in a taller facility, that means it needs to be further and further away from the residential areas such that it may be. So staff is prepared to bring the policy back to the council for formal action in December. We are here tonight seeking if there are any additional recommended changes or additional direction for staff. We will take that and incorporate that into a final version for the council. We don't recommend pursuing any consultant resources to further this policy. We believe at this point, based on the Planning Commission's recommendation, that and any direction from the council this evening, that it will be ready for action at a subsequent council meeting. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Johannesson.
Thanks. Dave, going through some of the other jurisdictions that have looked at this issue, there's a number of jurisdictions that run this through a conditional use permit process, and it looks like mainly It's because of it puts it through a design review project, or a design review process. And I think the comment about, these things are looking like trees or whatever is, it's to a certain extent it's humorous, but it's a reality that some of those just don't look good. And they do create visual blight. What is the rationale for not doing any design review and just having that? I mean, is there going to be any kind of design review? Or it's definitely would not come to us under this ordinance.
Well, we have done and continue to do conditional use permits for the major wireless facilities. We will not, perhaps it's somewhat of a matter of some of the semantics. We have invented this new permit type with new findings, but functionally would be very equivalent to a conditional use permit. And the design review aspect of it is still very real, because the principal level of discretion that is afforded to the local government is on the issue of aesthetics. And so we still maintain full discretion over that, and could determine that if a proposed monopine was not the appropriate design, that another design would be more appropriate for the given area, that we would still have that ability. It's just not called a conditional use permit anymore or design review, but we still retain full discretion over what the facility would look like.
But what happens is that pushes the decision down to the staff versus the planning commission or the council.
The planning commission ultimately would make the decision on these permits, which would be part of their principal part of their review on these facilities is aesthetics. And certainly any project that went through planning commission on appeal could be before the council.
All right. The other question now, basically what happens with these types of towers, they're mostly on private property, I would imagine. And whoever owns the property, certain royalties or lease payments by having these. One of the discussions that I was aware of in particular the Rivers neighborhood, is to locate a tower there and use the proceeds, lease revenues, to help benefit the community. Is there any opportunity here to maybe use city property on the location and then maybe help mitigate some of the impacts the tower would have in that particular area?
We certainly have entertained facilities. There is already a few on city property, including at the sewer treatment plant on South River Road. That one is there. We had been entertaining one out in Bridgeway Lakes on city property out there. That's still a project that's gone a little dormant, but is certainly one we've entertained. To have it on city property, one of the aspects of that makes that perhaps a little more favorable is by virtue of having the lease. It does give the city a little more control over the facility, and especially it hopes that we can be able to encourage co-location, which we find is amongst a very competitive industry is sometimes difficult to achieve. But by all means, the existing policy and the proposed policy certainly entertains having the concept of having those on city-owned property.
Yeah, it's probably not so much of a problem in the industrial area, but as you start putting these next to the 500-foot limit or whatever they're going to be, it's the residential areas, that's where it's going to be a little more problematic. And I mean, those are the calls we get, are these towers going next door and the visual impacts or radiation or whatever's coming out of this. So people are concerned about this type of thing.
Oh, absolutely. And we have one project we have worked on. We've been to the Planning Commission a couple times already, and with a community meeting, and we certainly have heard that there are a lot of concern about the facilities, and we've heard it that some people want a facility because they want to be able to use their phone at home, but we've also certainly heard the other side of the coin as well. So this is one of the reasons why I think the Planning Commission struggled on this and asked us to make some updates to the policy, because they were hearing both sides of the argument on that other project.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Villegas?
Thank you, Dave. No, this is a difficult work. I mean, it's easy. It makes sense to have a framework for the discussion. I know those of us that have sat on the Planning Commission, it's difficult. Sometimes it's easy to make the deciding decisions when it's sort of out of sight, out of mind for most folks. But when it's in a neighborhood and all the work has been done by the applicant to show that that's where it's needed in order to provide that better cell service, which we've all become more used to and accustomed to and we want, it certainly makes it easier when the Planning Commission has a framework to have the dialogue versus sort of all over the map. Because a lot of this is limited to what we can do and cannot do. So it certainly helps make the jobs a little bit easier once they come along. It's interesting, we have 23 now. I don't think we had any in the early 90s, or very few, and we've come a long ways, so it's good work. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Yeah, for me, this is really all about aesthetics. And, I mean, I would hate to have a deck in my backyard and walk out the deck, and the first thing I see is a great big cell tower. I mean, I live in a residential area, and I wouldn't want to have that there. And so the height limit certainly comes into play. The setback definitely comes into play because of line of sight. And so, I mean, isn't there a way in which we could do, we could put not necessarily a tower, but you can put an antenna in the bell tower at the Southport Shopping Center. You could put you could put an antenna on a light pole, and people don't notice that. They can get the coverage because you can put a bunch of different antennas around, or the contractor could do that. And then you don't have that aesthetic sort of blight that you potentially could have by having a setback of 300 feet and you've got a 90-foot, or you'd have a 90-foot tower. For me, that is, we're really heading in the wrong direction. We've got to, I mean, I think the technology out there today is, it's certainly getting better and better every day. I mean, I don't think that you would have that tree along the South River Road if today's standards were applied to that. I think there's better ways to do it. You could make it look better. I mean, I think that you could utilize a lot of things. You could utilize, River City High School. You could utilize, taller buildings in the industrial area. Because I noticed that even if you go to the port now, and on the silos and on the things that are there, you don't notice them. You don't notice them at all. And yet they're there. I think we could do the same kind of thing and really sort of preserve the aesthetic value of a neighborhood. Because when you get to allow these things to go into residential areas, it really sort of can skew that aesthetic value that we have. And so I personally, I don't care for the tower stuff. But I mean, I think you could go to Tower Market. You could go to different places that are around and put things so that they're not in a view of sight.
And we spent considerable amount of time at the Planning Commission talking about those exact applications, and we would certainly want to see those applications, made, if they are workable. And we have, tried to adjust the policy that even if some of those, the tower at Nugget Market, was used as an example, and even though that's within 500 feet of residential, Planning Commission wanted that if someone could mount one inside there, even if it was in 500 feet of residential, they were comfortable with that and just going to the zoning administrator as a way to try to encourage and incentivize those types of applications that you're referring to. And we would certainly, want to see those types of wireless applications made, if at all possible, and going to some type of tower or artificial structure being really a last resort. But our geography and topography, we're going to be limited, we believe, on the number of, building mount and roof mounted opportunities, where if most of those antennas, they like to be at least, 50 feet up. We don't foresee a lot of opportunities for roof mounting at those type of elevations, but by all means want to make whatever use of that opportunity we can so we don't have to build, any more poles, especially close to residential areas.
Esma?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. David, thanks for your work on this and working with the commission on some of the changes to our policy. As Mr. Villegas said, it certainly helps when you're making these decisions. I remember going through this many times in the last 10 years, trying to get some of the wireless towers into places and trying to find it. I remember we did the South River Road one. So your work here is appreciated. I do have a question though. I was reading on the staff report on page. I don't have the page number here, but in the permitting process, are we using to encourage the placement of placement of the towers on other buildings? Are we using the permitting process as a bit of an incentive to trying to get them to do that? Is that
Yes.
what I'm reading?
Yes, that is correct, and that was a specific recommendation
Yeah,
from
and
the
I think
Planning Commission.
that's very smart, because I think to Mr. Christoph's point, if we can get them there and leverage that, I think that's a plus. So again, I appreciate your work on this. I think this is great.
But it looks like the tail's wagging the dog. Because, I mean, if you don't say this is what we are going to do, and you still allow for a 60-foot tower to go in the backyard of somebody's house, then I think that we've defeated the purpose. Because it's not only, I mean, I certainly understand the landowner wanting the revenue or whatever it may be, but, you know, it's, I mean, we've got a brand-new pump station that's going on out in Southport. Why not put one on top of that thing? You know, I mean, I think that there's a lot of places that we can identify that these kinds of towers and things can go that gives the opportunity for the telecom industry to go ahead and put their towers up. And yet if you give them that wiggle room that they can go into residential, that's as far as it's going to go. They're not going to want to go to the tower and pay the landlord whatever they've got to pay him to get that there. They're not going to want to pay the RD district to put it on top of a plant that they built. Or you're not going to get them to go into the industrial area to, you know, put it on top of what, so that it is hidden. That is a major concern of mine. Thank you.
I mean, a lot has changed since before, and to me, the one of the biggest factors is safety. I mean, when we first had this policy up, well, when we did the policy revision after the congressional action to strip us of, you know, 40% of our authority, even in '97, cell phones were the only wireless technology out there. There weren't tablets and and cell phones were really just used to make phone calls. But there were very, very few households for whom the cell phone was their only telephone. And so, you know, we didn't treat cell phones like a luxury, but we kind of did. We said, look, our standards around location are going to trump the tower coverage because, you know, with the implicit notion that not everybody's going to has a cell phone. It's not essential, right? Today, that's not the case. There are a lot of households, I think you've noted in the report, that are cell phone dependent. It's their only means of communicating with the outside world, or with the outside world, including our emergency services communicating with them. And so, having you know, reliable, consistent penetration and coverage of all of the city, including all of the residential areas, is a dramatically higher priority, I think, than it was in 1997. So the balance around coverage versus the other issues has shifted, partly because of the law and partly because of the heavy dependence that more and more residents and businesses have on this technology. So I think the update is important, and the way that it's structured to try to incentivize the things that we do want to see happen, and while still making it more difficult for things that we don't want to have happen, even some of them that we can't stop, is a good approach to accomplish that. I do have a concern about stealthing, and I mean, I support it, but stealthing in the outcome, not stealthing in the mechanism. And I just want to be sure, because the way it's written in it, you know, in the definition of stealthing, and it says examples can include monopines and windmills and all of that. But a monopine isn't stealthing in an area of other kinds of trees. And honestly, the cell tower I hear more about in the city than any other one is that pine tree. Right, so I mean, it is the exact opposite of stealthing. But so I want to be sure that by the fact that we say that is an example of stealthing, that we're not giving an applicant, you know, a way to say your own policy already says that if I build a monopine, then I'm stealth, because that's not stealth. Is a emergent property of what it is that you've done in the context of the place. It's not just a monopine or a windmill stuck. You know, windmill put in the middle of Bridgeway Island or whatever isn't necessarily stealthing. I guess it could be designed properly, but I want to be sure that the language is clear. I know what's intended. I know what you intend is that there'll be you know, you'll do a substantive review and determine based on visual characteristics and all of that. But the way that the language is written, just saying that monopines are an example of stealthing. As you look at this between now and the time this comes back, you know, through the process and first reading, that we're clear that stealthing is about the actual visual outcome and not just about the mechanism. The second question is around the building, and I'm just looking at the areas where in E1 where that would be zoning administrative actions without regard to zone. And this matters because of the residential piece, but you know, I don't live in Southport, and so the obsession with just residential neighborhoods, as we traditionally think of them, to me is misplaced. I mean, these issues are just as important in the urban parts of the city, where we do have, you know, we've got a tower on West Cap, we've got a tower on Ballpark Drive. Those are going to be residential. They're mixed-use residential areas, but they're still residential areas, and so we can't just think of residents being in our traditional way. And so that waterfront zone, which isn't in the list under E1D, but it is in the rest of E1 because the rest of E1 is without regard to the zones, right?
Yeah, our intention there was to not have an application like Ms. Christoph like, for example, somewhere at the town center, where even though the property is, you know, maybe zone commercial, there still is residential and even mixed use, which could have residential right across the street.
Right.
So the Planning Commission was comfortable with that type of wireless application.
Right. So here's the problem with that. This conflates the notion of protected land uses equals residential. Right, and that is that we have, you know, they're in the waterfront zone, just as an example, or in the central business district zone. There are parts of those zones that are not residential at all, but that is absolutely and totally inappropriate to have even a partially masked. Well, I would not want to have a pine tree, you know, show up, you know, on Merkley, or you know, right on the waterfront. And so the rules, to the extent that they're written really with how do we protect residential neighborhoods, that's appropriate, but they shouldn't just be about residential neighborhoods, because there are places of value that have a lot of visual premium to them for the communities and for residences and for the city that aren't strictly residential in themselves. And so the rules need to account for that. It's not just about buffering houses; it's about protecting the valuable viewscapes and places in the city more generally. So I don't think it's far off from that, but you know, it was clearly written with the intention of trying to deal with concerns about residential location, which I get and I support, but we do need to pay attention to those as well. So A says, for example, new building mounted facilities where stealthing is employed without regard to zone could be a zoning administrator action. And so what does that mean? What is building mounted? If I have an existing building and I stick a thing that's not on the roof, so I'm not going to qualify for the roof mounted, but it comes off the side and then it goes up or something. And I make it look like a pine tree coming off the side of my building, and it shoots off right into the viewscape looking down Ballpark Drive that you would have otherwise seen the river and the ballpark. Now you see this pine tree coming off the side of a McDonald's.
Is that going to be a zoning administrator action?
Well, under that, a building mounted, application, we would typically expect to see, which is like one that was already approved, where they actually would mount the panel antennas right on the facade of the building. Clearwire was going to do that on the Jackmar building out in Southport Industrial Park. So that was the kind of the application we had in mind as a building mounted, in the more urban context, that's what we would expect to see is roof and building mounted rather than, a freestanding structure, such as the now infamous, monopine or other application. So, this example you're bringing to, even if it is at a zoning administrator level, that's still noticed, and we still retain discretion, over that, even if it is at the zoning administrator level.
All right, but this is we're making a zoning administrator not because we're inundated with these, but because we're trying to create a path of, this is what we really want you to do. Right, so here's the easy ones. And so I just want to be sure that on the roof piece, we say, it's roof as long as there's not a proliferation of antenna coming off the roof. That makes it look like the whole building is about the antenna. But if you put it on the side, I mean, if you mount it on the building, on the front or the side or whatever, and not the roof, we don't have that same standard. Right, so there.
Yeah, we've at least, made an attempt under, subsection A there to address where it is a building mounted, where we would want a panel antenna to, make it as if it was part of the original, building design. I've worked on these kind of projects in the past where, in some cases, you would have thought those panel antennas had been there all along because they were well integrated with the building's overall architecture, colors, materials. So that's what we were attempting at, but we can certainly bring the concepts here in subsection B to expand those, into building A. And under section B, what we're attempting to try to control is kind of the antenna farms that are often common on, taller buildings.
Right, and so the key to me, I'm not sure the proliferate on B, that the proliferation is really the test. The test ought to be, even if it's just one, does the one become a dominant feature when viewed from the public street, the adjacent buildings, or impede the view from the public view corridor? To me, that should be the test. I mean, it's not that you have so many that it's creating that, but is the one, because you don't have an architectural standard on the roof-mounted piece. Right, so I'm not sure. I don't want to write it, with you right now. I'm just trying to raise some issues to please pay attention to that aren't about the residential location issue as it comes back again. So, other questions or comments? Okay, this is a workshop.
I thought this was going back to the planning commission. No, huh?
No, we were not anticipating going back to the planning commission unless that was your direction.
Planning Commission certainly raised a number of issues, and the vote was not unanimous. So I don't know if it needs to go back there or not. Probably prefer that it does to address some of these issues, but I'm not sure where it'll ultimately end up.
Pleasure.
It seemed that the commission had those two main concerns around height and setback. I mean, were pretty much everything else?
Those were the major, matters that they wanted us to raise to the council if the council had any direct input on those two items. But otherwise, they did vote, albeit not unanimously, to recommend the council adopt, this policy that we've presented before you, this evening. But we do have provisions in the policy that do address height and setbacks, and at least the majority of the planning commission voted to recommend those provisions be included in the policy that you have before you this evening.
So they did approve the 2 times the height requirement on the setback?
Yes, that was
okay,
that was
I
part
wasn't
of
sure
the
if that
policy
came
that
before or
went
after.
to them. Yeah, it was part of the policy that went to them.
Mr. Villegas?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. I mean, it seems to me this is a bit of a shift from what they've worked on, and they've spent a lot of time on this. I mean, it would seem to me that we'd want to have their input on this piece because the project, I mean, the policy isn't it doesn't otherwise incorporate their opinions about this piece, and it is a shift. So, I mean, I would prefer that they take a look at it with some guidance from staff based on this evening's dialogue to flesh out a component that addresses the non-residential piece.
I mean, I think Christopher's raised some issues, and I think they need to digest that. So, I mean, I would send it back. I don't see why not.
Are we on a time element with this?
Not in so much as that there are, projects, waiting in the wings for it. We certainly have been trying to, limit how much overall time, we spend on this particular effort, as part of our this wasn't an item that was in our work program, but it is certainly, if we want it, and the topics that are the main things that were left over from the Planning Commission were topics that we did discuss at length at the commission, and they sought if there was any direction from the council on those items that, we would, seek that when this came forward. But they did make an action, did recommend approval of the policy that you have in front of you this evening.
Mr. Ross, were you?
I was just going to suggest that the Planning Commission did deliberate on this a good deal of time. They didn't reach unanimous conclusions, and I don't think they would if you sent it back. But it would, I think, be an additional burden on staff and additional burden on the Planning Commission to revisit this.
Okay. That's the question I was actually going to follow up with. And that's a consideration that I certainly want to factor in. And I don't want to create additional work unnecessarily.
When would you anticipate this coming to us for first reading?
Our intention was to come back on December 6th, I believe, is that the first meeting in December?
And is there a commission meeting between now and then?
There will be one between now and then.
And don't you have a component of the meeting where you brief the commission on, I don't go, but you two of you have been there. Don't you have a component of the meeting where you brief the commission on the council's
Yes, we do in the
relevant
beginning.
council actions and discussions? I mean, it's one way to handle it. If you do that briefing, and if the commission, throws its body in front of it and says, no, we weren't given that, we'd like to see it again, I'd be open to doing it. But if they should be aware of what we're doing, and if they want to ask for it back, then I think it sounds like
I think that's a sound
willingness to do
approach.
that.
Yep, sounds good.
That works for me.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, item 10
Charlie would probably kill me. But
is presentation presentation and discussion of the AB 109 realignment plan. Chief Drummond.
Good evening. Maybe I should just get, no. Okay, I'm okay. Good evening. I'd like to take this opportunity to present you and the community with an overview of Assembly Bill 109 and associated trailer legislation that implements the criminal justice realignment. Probably the biggest change in the California criminal justice system in memory. And so it's been quite a challenging and interesting time that we're just really entering into right now. So really, we just wanted to cover a couple of highlights. There's only 8 slides here, and I won't necessarily be reading those slides to you, but we wanted to give you some highlights of what AB 109 does, and what it doesn't do is almost just as important for community information. And some of the things that it affects 2 groups of people. It affects new commitments that would have gone to state prison, new convictions and commitments that would have gone to state prison will now be served at local detention facilities. And then it affects releases from state prison that would have been under state parole supervision that will no longer be under state parole supervision. And the line of demarcation for this is a population described as non. You may have heard those. Non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offender as registrant under 290 of the Penal Code. Those are the populations that are affected by Assembly Bill 109. And so what happens after October 1st, what has happened is that anybody sentenced for a new commitment will be under those new sentencing laws. And so if it was a non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offense, they will be serving that time in local detention facilities and not committed to state prison. At the same time, releases from state prison will be coming back to the community, and instead of being under parole supervision, they will come under local supervision. And we'll talk a little bit about the approach in Yolo County in just a little bit when we go into just a little more detail. But importantly, what this will not do, this will not accelerate the release of any felons from state prison. Nobody is getting early release dates. They serve their normal sentence that they would have served. And so also what it's doing, it is not sending any additional people back to the community that would not have been released anyway under the old provisions and just gone under parole supervision. So these are not new individuals coming back to our community. It's just the mechanisms and the structure for monitoring and treating them are different than they were before. So I think that's very important for the community to understand. And so in Yolo County, the approach has been the legislation created a community corrections partnership in each county in the state. And that's a large group of different disciplines, multidisciplinary approach on it. And from that group, the legislation prescribed an executive committee of seven members. And that executive committee was charged with the responsibility to develop the plan and then submit it to the Board of Supervisors for approval. And so in our county, we are one of the few counties that took what I'll call a broader-based approach than many counties in the state, and that local law enforcement agencies were included in the plan, albeit at a small level. Of the approximately $3.3 million in funding available for the first year, which was a three-quarter year, just an October through June funding year, there was about $3.3 million available. So the local city police agencies were allocated about $300,000 of that, just around 9% of the funding. The majority of the funding went to probation departments and sheriff's departments, because they actually have the primary responsibility. The group of offenders coming out, released on what would have been parole, are now a new population described as post-release community supervision offenders. So we've been using the term PRCS for this post-release community supervision group. And so they are coming out back to their county of residence, and so they will be under the supervision of the probation department in conjunction with partnerships with the police departments. And it was actually the probation department that recognized the value of the partnerships. These are many times people that are known to us. They are people where we've dealt with. We know where they live and all their contacts. And so probation department considered our involvement key to be able to monitor these people. One of the key aspects of this is not a punitive-based system. The idea here is to address recidivism and hopefully do a better job than the old system did. The old system had a 67 to 70% recidivism rate on people released from state prison. And so one of the primary metrics that we're using is to improve upon that rate. Of course, it wouldn't take a great deal to do better than that. And so that's what we're hoping to do. But you realize before you can treat and train and educate people, equip them to become productive members of the community, there has to be an accountability structure That's the first step in the process, to provide that accountability so that they will stick with the programs, the training, the treatment that they're supposed to do. And so that's the part that the police departments and probation department will be working together on. Probation department has actually opened a new branch office in the county branch center adjacent to the police department, and we'll be working very closely with our staff. Already talked a little bit about this non, so I won't go into that anymore. What will happen, though, most of the county sheriffs do not have the bed space to accommodate significant increases in population. In our county, the sheriff has about 30 beds that were closed because of budget reductions, and the sheriff's departments receive funding to restore those 30 beds, and so that will help. But absent any new construction, which is not on the horizon, the sheriff is going to be relying on a large expansion of the home detention electronic monitoring program, possibly as much as a 10-fold expansion of that. From about 50 people now, kind of an average daily population of about 50, to as many as 500 in the ultimate build-out. Now, these people will be in our communities, and so we also are going to share some of that responsibility and interact. They are monitored, as you know, 24/7, and if there's an alert because of the equipment's been tampered with, has been removed, or they've gone straight too far from home base, there's going to be an alert. And the sheriff's department does not have the resources to respond 24/7 to the entire county to do that, and so we're going to be also assisting with that, as well as assisting the probation department. Obviously, again, sanctions are part of the program, but not the purpose of the program. But again, you need to hold people accountable, and so there is no more ability to do a parole revocation, which was a fairly quick and painless process when you found somebody out of compliance with their conditions of parole. And essentially, you had that revocation hearing, and then, they were back in state prison for a year with no good and work time on that revocation. Here, there's something called flash incarceration, which again is going to be dependent on the sheriff's ability. So it's equivalent to a revocation before under the parole system, under flash incarceration, to take somebody who's in violation, in serious violation, off the street. And then you can get a longer jail time by going through a hearing process up to 180 days. But that time is subject to good and work time allowances, so it really reduces the time to about a maximum of 90 days, day for day, on good time. And so that is going to be one of the tools for non-compliance. But our goal in the monitoring and compliance phase is actually to help people stay in compliance. It's not to hassle people, but it's to make sure that, hey, you are going to your classes, you're going to your treatment, you're where you're supposed to be, when you say you're supposed to be, you're not in the company of certain people, you're not under the influence of things. So the idea is to provide that accountability and structure so that they can be successful in those other components of the program. You saw what came out of the executive committee. I already mentioned this was approved by the board, the plan, after some discussion. It was a 5-0 approval of the plan, although they wanted to, obviously, they wanted to see more details and more, strategies detailed, but we had to get up and running before we could provide some of that information. So this is just the detail that of how the money is going to be, or what areas that money is going to be spent. The board also then, subsequent to approving the plan, approved the budget for the plan. That was, I believe, 2 weeks ago. I was at the board meeting on a 4-to-1 vote. they approved the allocation of the $3.3 million to match the plan. Numbers coming out on those PRCS population, about 23 a month has been the projected number for Yolo County. We'll probably get a slightly higher proportion of that than our population is of total county population. We're estimating, based on commitments, maybe 30 to 33% could be West Sacramento cases that will be here with us. And there's also going to be people sentenced locally, and that's a smaller number, so the sheriff will have some time to gear up. Approximately, under the new sentencing guidelines, approximately 10 per month is the estimate there. Like I said, our county was really one of the counties that others in the state looked to for our model. We were one of the early ones out there, and the approach of sharing, multidisciplinary, in a multidisciplinary approach was looked at as, hey, this is something for the rest of us to look at. So everybody was involved in the process and got some piece of the funding. Of course, the funding is subject to evidence-based practice outcomes, but of those practices. And for us, you say, well, what could that be for police departments and probation departments on the monitoring side? I think we're looking at two very basic primary things. One is no increase in victimization from having this population back in our communities and under our shared supervision while they're going through their treatment and their rehabilitation, that we don't want to see any new victims in the community. And so we're monitoring their contacts with law enforcement, their arrests. And then the second piece to that I already mentioned is the recidivism rate. We're looking at that as a basic measure of success. All the different entities, though, that's going to apply to everybody, is that's going to be the ultimate test. Are people committing less crimes and not returning to prison based on this? And so those are the approaches that we're looking at. That's the end of the slides. I'd be happy to answer any questions about it. Just want to give you a quick, brief overview and then mostly respond to questions that you had.
Mr. Johannesson.
Yeah, thank you, Chief, for that presentation. I'm not that familiar with the difference between the services provided by probation and parole. Are they similar? Because it looks like similar populations are going to be monitored by similar parole or probation. Are the services basically the same for those two groups? Or can you explain the differences between the services that would be provided on parole versus probation?
They are very similar. Basically what the difference has been in the past is the more serious offenders, the felony offenders, were committed to state prison. And so when they were released, they became that whole monitoring treatment function went to state parole because it was still part of the state system. The lesser offenders, those committed to county jails, went to probation to provide that supervision and monitoring treatment aspect. So really they do provide the same services. The difference for probation is going to be they're going to be dealing with a much more higher levels, criminal sophistication, and so that's where they realized that they needed the partnership of the police departments who know this population probably better than they do, at least at the outset.
Does it mean building a better capacity within the probation and just the caseworkers with that different population?
Yes, it does. That's where a bulk of their money went to, is actually hiring just additional probation officers to handle the caseloads. They're trying to work on a 50-to-1 caseload basis if they can keep to that level.
But, I mean, is it different training, though, that's required, or is it just more manpower?
No, I think in talking to Chief Rist, there is some different levels of training, which we're actually going to be participating, not just West Sacramento, but the cities are going to be participating along with the probation officers in that training too.
Right, thank you.
Now, there are some specific questions and comments on the substance, which I know we want to get to. I do want to say something about the process, though, because I think we have a significant failure of governance in this process that what has been described, I think even on the slides, is an importance of collaboration. It's a partnership composed of city and county departments. We're getting briefed on this 2 months after the final plan was approved, 5 months after the draft was submitted for public outreach. I feel like, this is the first, other than a colleague saying, we should hear about this, I don't know that we would have been engaged in it at all. And given the impact, the disproportionate impact in our community, the resource level that we're talking about, this should have been at council at some point for a briefing, for participation. We should not be in a partnership. We shouldn't be in a legal partnership that the council did not elect to join, or at least was not even aware that we were participating in. And so there are questions about the substance of it. I have them too, and I think the good work has been done. But I am very concerned about the way in which this is proceeded. It's sort of the law enforcement agencies and the related agencies in the county sort of collaborated as though they are separate from the democratically elected governments, and other than the county board of supervisors, because they have a statutory role to play. But we've made commitments as a city to do certain things. We've made proposals about how to spend money and what the policy should be, and knowing that we have a disproportionately large number of parolees and probationers, that has been a longstanding concern and issue for the community at large and for the council. That I don't think it's appropriate that it's only at this stage that we're getting this as an after-the-fact information item. But, Mr. Ledesma.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I would agree with you that I'm going to comment on the process, but I share the same concern, and that this is coming a bit late. So I'll underscore your point, but I do want to comment on the process, which I appreciate the slides and the work you've done with the other agencies. And part of, one of the things, this is a new area for me to understand your jurisdiction and the roles you play, and the whole realignment issue is new to everyone, but certainly having to learn that now because it's filtering down to our police officers and department. You certainly broke down a lot of myths about who is being released and what we'll care for. That I think that the fact that we're starting a public education campaign, I can't emphasize enough the need to kind of get some of this information out there, because the way it was portrayed to me by others was people are going to be running around the streets, loose, and we won't have any officers or any process to kind of rein it in. And you've certainly shown that's not the case. Nobody's being released that wasn't going to be released already. I think those are just really critical points that we need to find. I'd ask you to work with the city manager and think about how we can get this information out. So something that I will begin to talk, I can speak factually about. And I would like a copy of the slides as well as the city clerk to provide that. Because these are things that we just can't, I could not until tonight be able to say for certain how this impacts us and how we're dealing with it. A couple of things that also kind of jumped out at me, the fact on how will we measure a success in dealing with this a year from now when we look back at, or a year after implementation, because it sounds like you're already starting the process of implementing this, and so it is important that we know what is working, what isn't, and kind of get updates often about how this is impacting us, how it's taking away time or the need for resources, or you having to restructure things. I think that's a very important point that we understand, for better or for worse. And maybe things work out better than we won't get the disproportionate or high proportion of the share of projected folks coming into West Sacramento. But Again, those are the kind of things I'm going to want to know about, because I think a year from now, people are going to be still talking about this, and especially in a campaign year. And I think it's important, critically important, we have the facts out there about how we're handling it, how we're doing, and what we're actually seeing. So I appreciate the work you've done. I just would urge you to kind of continue this track of making sure we have the facts and the public has the facts, more importantly.
We'll do that.
Thank you.
Mr. Villegas?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thanks, Chief. I know it's a lot of work. I know you've put a lot of time and energy into putting this thing together. I'll underscore what was underscored in terms of the process. And I guess for me, the reason I underscore what's already been underscored is in part because, crime in this community has been the #1 issue, or has been, or was for a long time. And you were a part of a significant change. And so we've come a long ways. And I think, the significance of this sort of statewide initiative has the potential, as anybody has said, to change everything overnight. Nobody really knows what's going to happen, as evidenced by the papers in terms of all the argument going back and forth about this can make things better or potentially can make things worse. Nobody really knows. I think you have a good plan. I think it's evident that the work that you've put into it has been thought through. The collaboration is unique. If you look at plans throughout the state, they're not as collaborative. In fact, they're still arguing and still fighting about a lot of it, although the data's already come and gone, that they have to have a plan in place. Personal feelings about some of the elements of it, but in terms of the process, I feel the council absolutely needs to be kept abreast of these kinds of things as they're moving forward, regardless of how minimal our input is in this process. I know it was sort of delegated to the county probation department. I know you took an active role, and I respect that, stepping up and doing that. But I think these kinds of things, to the extent that there are updates and there are milestones being reached, we ought to be kept in the loop on as they move forward. So in terms of the actual determining a year from now, so let's go a year from today, and I know you talked about the recidivism being sort of the key piece of this. For me, there's other things, because recidivism is one piece, but the rate itself, the crime rate itself, is another. And I'm less concerned, I guess, about how others might measure their rate of success or their crime rate, given where we've come in the last 10 to 15 years. And I'm just wondering how and what are the things that you're going to use 12 months from now and 24 months from now to say it's working, the plan that we put together is successful, the jury's still out, or we need to go back to the table and rethink this because it's not working. And as you said earlier, are disproportionately, or I don't know if it's disproportionately high or low, but in any case, 33% of the folks that are in our community now that wouldn't have otherwise been are wreaking havoc. And I just want to understand what's the check-in point that we should all be looking at collectively to say we need to go back to the table.
When I referred to earlier, one of our major concerns was increased victimization. That was really a way of referring to the crime rate. And so that is going to be one of the key check-in points is, we're also going to track individual contacts with these individuals. So how often are we coming in contact with them? What's the nature of that contact? And, are they suspects in new additional crimes? Are there additional arrests? So those are some of the intermediate points that we're looking at that lead up eventually to, are they being recommitted to local or state prisons? So those are some of the indicators that we'll be looking at. I think from the treatment side, the education side, those entities are going to be tracking, their interactions, their participation in those programs, their successful completion. Are they finding meaningful work? Those are some of the things that the other partners are going to be tracking and reporting.
I guess that's the question that I have, though. I want to make sure, because the idea of saying they, it's not they anymore, it's we, because we now have sort of joined at the hip with other partners throughout the county. So this system, this realigned system, this reformed system, in my mind, at least that's my mind, we are no longer able to say you know, in the city, we manage the police department, and that's our role, and that the county's responsible for the other components of the criminal justice system. In my mind, we're all in this together now. This is a completely different ballgame, and so this notion of I don't view it that way anymore. I view it as we, because the plan itself no longer distinguishes necessarily, in my mind, the difference anymore. The participant, you know, the folks that are now kept local are going to be kept local for good. The state's not taking these folks back. This is not a reversible trend. This is only one direction. And so I just want to make sure that the way we are approaching whether or not it's going to work, and I'm optimistic. I think there are a lot of good reasons to think that we will be successful in light of what I've seen. I mean, what I've seen in the plan, I think bears itself for some good results. But I just want to make sure we have a check-in point to say, you know, not that the crime rate has changed dramatically and now we have to shift everything we're doing, but to check in periodically so that we know whether or not the trend is moving in the right direction. And I guess I would like to see a bit more as to how we're going to measure that. And I know it's probably premature, but I'd still like to see a little bit more about how it is we are going to measure that. And I know in the plan itself, and it's pretty well laid out. There are some pieces that are sort of still being worked on. I know that you sort of left them like that for good reason. I mean, you don't really know everything that you're dealing with at the moment. But I'd like to see a bit more, certainly at least a check-in point at some point. If we need to say, hey, we need to get back to the table because it's not working, I certainly want to preserve that as an option. So for people at home who really don't live and breathe this as, well, most people don't. I do, partly because it's my 8 to 5. What is it? Can you give me a sense of what the profile looks like of the 33% that are going to come to West Sacramento? What does that look like for folks? I know we're hearing the non-nons, and I think people get kind of what that might be, but what does that look like?
Well, probably a typical example of, and, you know, the public is going to have a different perception than those involved in the process of what a nonviolent, non-serious you know, crime is. For instance, if there's a burglary at a home and a resident is in the home at the time of the burglary, that is going to not qualify under AB 109. That will be a serious offense, not a non-serious offense, not a non-serious offense. So that will still be that you would go to state prison upon conviction and be subject to supervision by state parole upon release. But in the same vein, a burglary while you're not at home would now fall under the non-serious category. And so would be sentenced in local detention and then supervised as a as a PRCS kind of release by probation and or police departments. That's one example of what it might look like, that people could probably relate to that. But the typical serious crimes, rape, robbery, murder, manslaughter, you know, those types of things obviously are still in the serious and violent categories, and those will be in state prison. But things like auto theft is going to be a non. And so those folks will not be in state prison. So there's another example.
Okay. Okay, well, that's helpful. I guess the thing that I would like to see is, I know you've set aside a pretty good amount of money in the plan, at least for the first year, given that it's only a 3/4 year, $3.5 million or $3.3 million. I guess I'd like to see is, in light of all the investment in the data and the collection of outcomes and all the other things that you mentioned earlier, is a check-in point. I mean, what's a reasonable check-in point to say, is this going in the right direction, given what we knew at the time? Should we continue down this path, or should we shift gears and go somewhere different? And I know there's a tremendous amount of flexibility to the counties to sort of figure out what it is they need to do. Every county is doing it differently, in looking at all the plans. And so I'd like to pick a point. I don't know if you have anything in mind, but I'd like to, at least in my mind, be able to say, here's a point where we ought to be shooting for, And if at this point it's working, or if it needs to be tweaked, I'd like to have that conversation with you to say, here, I mean, you're the expert, you're the one that's gonna be on the ground figuring it out. So I'd like to hear from you what you think is working or what's not, and have that dialogue so that the rest of the folks in the community can kind of hear where we're headed. Because this is one of those things where, there's a little bit of attention placed on it, well, a lot of attention placed on it now, but a few months from now, people are gonna forget, what was that whole thing about? They're not gonna really remember unless things go bad. And at that point, I wanna be able to say, we've got a check-in point, we're gonna do something different if it's not working for us.
Yeah, those check-in points are going to be occurring. The way the process is still working, the Community Corrections Partnership still meets on a monthly basis. And then there's a working group below that Community Corrections Partnership group. And they're meeting right now on a weekly basis. And we are having, for instance, a workshop with the Board of Supervisors on November 22nd, I think it is, 21st or 22nd. And during that's a workshop format where we're actually discussing with the supervisors specific strategies and approaches and report back dates. And so I think that will be developed out of those continuing meetings, and we'll have that information and those reports to be able to share with all the entities involved.
Well, I'd like to pick a point where we say, okay, at this point, we're going to have some dialogue about it, because I personally have invested a tremendous amount of energy and capital in making sure that this community is safer than it's ever been, and I absolutely do not want to reverse that trend. I don't think we will, but I absolutely don't even want to find out after the fact that is slipped in the wrong direction in light of some things that we maybe let go or that we couldn't get because of this negotiation. So I want to have some point where which I can say, here's a check-in point, here's an absolute check-in point that you're comfortable with to say, here's what's happening, here's what we know, and here's what we don't know, and here's the things we didn't expect.
Right. I think the initial discussion so far amongst the partners in the group have focused on initial 6-month snapshot to see what data can be gathered and what picture is starting to come into focus at that point. So more will become clearer after the meeting, I think, on the 22nd. Okay. So, but that's where the ballpark that we're in, I believe.
Okay. All right.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Yeah, Chief. I am a little perplexed as far as why this is the first time we've really heard a detailed address on the report. I mean, I would have thought that someone would have at least been briefing us as we go along so that we can get some questions answered up front, and maybe we as a community could have some influence in the policy. It doesn't seem like we're going to be able to. We may be able to tweak it later on. I certainly hope so. But, I mean, you and I have had discussions many, many times as far as the parole situation. I mean, you know and I know that we get more than our fair share. We get more than just the people that have come from here, because you guys have arrested them. And I want to make sure that something like that stops. I mean, then I think we could have something that we could say, hey, this program, it's really got a legitimate shot at working. But, until we do that, I mean, I realize we have some other issues that we need to work on as a council, and we have been working on them for a long time, as far as the motels, as far as affordable housing, as far as all of those other kinds of things that lead to some of the parole issues. But, I certainly want to make a very strong point that that's one of the areas that I'm going to be looking at. The other thing is I think I'm following where some of these, where the rest of the council is going, and that is I want to develop a report card. And one of the things I want to be able to compare it with, because we have made I think we've made some really good strides, and the public out there feels that we've made some really good strides. and that is, if we start with a baseline of September 1st, 2011, and then you take that out 6 months, I want to see what we have done as far as crime rate, recidivism, all of the other things that this program is supposed to try to correct. I'd like to see something like that so that I can look at it, and I can just look at this empirical data, and I can say, you know, our crime rate went down 2%. That's really, you know, hey, okay, that's good. We're still moving along. Folks out there are happy. They're not getting robbed, and their cars aren't getting hijacked, and all the other kinds of things. But if it has gone from a baseline of 2, 3, or we'll say 7%, if it's gone from a baseline to 7% to 10%, then that's going to give us a sign that says, okay, wait a minute, we've got something going wrong. We have got to make some changes. Personally, I think we need to change the law. But that's, hey, it ain't going to happen. I don't have that kind of authority. The only one that does around here is Christopher. But I don't have that kind of authority. So I think that I would like to, you know, to maybe set something up so that we can have this grading system, or whatever you want to call it, a report card. I don't care what it is. But for me, it makes it easier to go out and to explain to the people what's happening.
I understand.
Okay.
Mr. Johannesson.
Maybe just to follow up the metrics issue, I haven't gone through the bills in great detail, but how is the state in the prison system, what metrics are they using? Because are they going to be tracking what's happening at the county level now, or is it up to the counties to divide that? Or is there some way that someone's tracking this?
The state has
Their hands off?
no oversight, has kind of washed their hands of this particular population.
Now, do you know, because every county is going to have to deal with it, is there a group or a sense of what metrics are going to be relevant that all counties may be able to report? Something consistent so they're reporting, you know, you can compare counties to counties on how well they're doing, like a standard set of measurements, you know, if you started September 1st and go out 6 months.
I understand what you're talking about. There's nothing, of course, in the legislation at all. It's totally wide open at the discretion. But what is happening as the probation officers network with each other, as the sheriff's network, as the chief's network, everybody's coming closer to what you're talking about, to how are we going to measure progress? What is progress? You know, what does success look like? And so there's nothing that's dictated. I think it was Councilman Villegas said that, hey, every county's free to essentially take the approach that they want. But just by the fact that everybody's trying to feel their way through this, you know, the networking that's going on, the discussions, the interactions are drawing people. You see some key themes that I think are going to appear in most counties, and you'll be able to do some, I think, meaningful comparisons after a length of time.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I appreciate the evidence-based approach that this framework tries to do, and I agree with every one of the comments that's been made about both the quality of the work, and also the major challenges and the concerns and the accountability. I'm trying to. I read the document that I think did you send it to us? The actual county-approved plan plus the underlying LIPSI study that it seems to be the basis for everything. Like there's one guy who you know in that specific analysis says, and I know you know this, but that the research that is in that document provides an encouraging indication of the large effects that might be attainable in actual practice, but his work, he says, cannot be interpreted as evidence that these practices actually have such effects, or indeed that they have any positive effects at all. So that's the evidence on which the evidence-based approach is based is encouraging, you know, in terms of providing some directions about alternatives to either confinement or to hyper-intensive supervision. But the evidence is not that compelling either. And so I think all the comments about we need to be on this and we need to be careful, we need to be collecting the right data so we know on recidivism and on crime rates and all these other pieces that we're tracking it ourselves, because the report kind of gives, and it necessarily does, but it gives it says this providing GED training will is generally under the research reduces recidivism by 26% or whatever, and that's true, but there's like 2 studies that have been done on that, and they have big margins of error. We can't rely on that data, and it's not California specific, it's not Yolo County specific, it's certainly not West Sacramento specific. So it is essential, and I know this is a non-trivial part of the money that's being allocated to the departments, that we collect good, robust data over time that allows us to both get the dashboard that we need as a council and our partners in this other cities in the county and the other agencies, but also so that we can actually start to build a better research base ourselves about what actually works in this community, as opposed to what works in some analysis of 500 studies across the country. So I think that's an important part of the long-term design of this, but I think my colleagues are absolutely right. There's a lot of public anxiety about this, and appropriately so. It's a gigantic experiment from the legislature, and those have tended not to work out very well. And so folks are concerned, and they should be, but for us to be able to help help the public deal with those concerns, we need to be fully educated about exactly what's happening and what the outcomes and the results are.
I understand.
I guess one of the other things I would say too, and is one of the anxieties that the public has, and I think the chief made 2 different points. One is to have your car stolen, and the other one is to have a burglary happen when you're not home. People really feel violated. They're really, really angry. And I mean, it's a big deal to them. Mm-hmm. And to have our legislators say that, or whomever, say this is a no, it just really grates them the wrong way, because that's a total violation of, their home or their car is something that's important to them. And, it's just, to have somebody come out and say that's a no is like, it's sort of a slap in the face, you wish you could put those people away, because, if somebody gets a burglary and they, gets burglarized, well, some reason or another, 2 blocks away, it gets burglarized again, and then 3 blocks away, it's burglarized again, something else is, you're going, wait a minute, there's something going on here, and it's just, I don't know, it's just something that the public is really aware of, and I know they, to look at it like it's not an important thing, it just sort of grates them the wrong way. And I know you know that. You hear that every day.
All right, any other comments or discussion? All right, thanks, Chief.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to council calendar. Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Mayor, we do not meet again until November 16th, but I wanted to point out that Friday, November 11th is Veterans Day. We're going to have the Veterans Day Parade that is going to take place from 2 to 4 p.m., and it's going to end at Sam Combs Park, where there's going to be a little celebration.
Any questions on the calendar? City manager report.
I wanted to let the council know that next week the executive team will be taking their annual workshop. We'll be doing it one day in West Sacramento and one day in Roseville, where we'll examine some of the programs and issues they have, and particularly focusing on their economic development strategies. And so
you're going shopping? Is that
we won't be going to the Galleria except to examine fire.
Please don't spend any money.
No money will be spent. Well, that's not quite true. There will be some meals. So that's scheduled for Wednesday and Thursday of next week.
Okay. Any questions on the city manager report? City attorney report? Staff direction for members of the council? We have no future agenda item requests. Is there a motion to adjourn? It's moved by Mayor Pro Tem Christoph, Seconded by Mr. Johannesson. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Meeting is adjourned.